Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and tonight I wanted to take you through what is without a doubt the most important contest in America, the United States Chess Championships. However, I'm not going to go over the games of Wesley So, who did walk away with the championship trophy this year. But I'm going to go over the games of one Bobby Fischer, because Wesley So's performance in the 2020 championships was pretty historic. He was 2 points off a perfect score by my counts. But, you know, not to be outdone, Bobby Fischer was not 2 points off a perfect score. He actually did get a perfect score in this 1963-64 championship. And I wanted to take you through a few games that really show the just total domination that Bobby Fischer had over his competition in this tournament. He had to win 11 games in a row to get the perfect score, and over 11 games, every aspect of your chess is going to be tested, as it was for Bobby Fischer. So let's see some of his competitive matchups, how he actually came out on top, and what had to be done to get that historic 11-0 score. All right, jumping right into it. One of his main competitors in the event was one Larry Evans, a U.S. champion in his own right, and I think Evans did end up actually getting second place in the tournament with a very, very good score as well, but of course not quite as good as 11-0 that Bobby put up this year. So let's take a look and see what happened. We had E4 by Bobby Fischer, E5, and then in round 2 of the event, that's the round that this game was played. Bobby had won sort of a long and arduous first round game. It went down to this end game, and Bobby managed to outplay his opponent. And perhaps with that long and arduous victory in mind, Bobby decided he was going to do something a little bit differently, right? You know, why slog it out in a long end game when you can just play the King's Gambit and make sure one way or another the game is going to get interesting. So, of course, these days, the King's Gambit, it's a huge debate whether or not this is totally sound. I think most of the top players these days kind of agree with good play, Black can get a little bit of an advantage against this move. How can Black get an advantage? Well, White put a pawn on f4, and that square is attacked, and that square is not defended. So Larry Evans decided he would capture the pawn for free, and that is generally what they say is the way to start scoring for an advantage here. Bobby plays the very, very combative bishop c4. Knight f3 is a bit more common these days, controlling h4 and g5, two critical squares for Black. And after bishop c4, Larry Evans attempted to sort of refute this move, right? Most players go knight f3 to defend these squares. Bishop c4 does not defend those squares, and Larry Evans decided to come after Bobby here with the move queen h4 check, just directly checking the king, forcing a concession here. And I think these days most players are not actually playing this move queen h4. It gets into some really, really crazy lines, but maybe this is not the safest path for Black to continue. But it is what we see in this game. Alternatives, by the way, just the simple knight f6, and even d5 is a playable move here, with some ideas of sacrificing this pawn back for quick play in the center. But in this game, queen h4 check, going after the king. Of course, g3 would be unplayable. If f takes g, now White is in the middle of a pretty unfortunate pin. So king f1 is sort of the only move for White here. And now Black continues to sort of try and hold on to everything with the move d6. And this is sort of the attempt at refuting the King's Gambit that Larry is doing here, right? Black is attempting to keep everything, right? Black checks the White king, so the White king can no longer castle. Black is defending this f4 pawn with the queen, trying to hold on to it. And Black is also not willing to sort of give this pawn back with these sacrifices like d5 that I just mentioned. Stuff like d5, stuff like not going queen h4, that's going to be a much safer approach for Black. But with queen h4 and d6, like I said, Black wants to have his cake and eat it too, which against Bobby could be a recipe for disaster, getting a bit greedy. Bobby just continues with natural development with knight c3, and I think that's pretty instructive here. A lot of players, you know, in their heart are really wanting to play sort of wild and crazy gambits, but I think a common mistake that a lot of amateur level players make when they play these crazy gambits is that they play bishop c4 and they sacrifice their pawn with f4 and they say, okay, now I have to go checkmate. But first and foremost, the idea of any gambit is to get rapid development and rapid, an accelerated version of getting your pieces into the game. So knight c3, very, very good move, just developing the pieces. We saw bishop e6 by Larry Evans. Now black is willing to offer up a trade of pieces. He's played d6, kept his pawn on f4, and now it's just a question of weathering the storm by Bobby Fischer here, right? Can black defend these loose squares around the king, especially in particular this d5 square? Of course, bishop takes e6 would be a bad move by Bobby. F takes e6, and then something like e5 is going to come, and black will be able to hold on to this pawn. But queen e2 is the choice by Bobby Fischer in this game, keeping pieces on the board and trying to accelerate the development even further. Bobby Fischer isn't really worried about the trade of the bishops, but now if black does want to trade, notably, it's going to come at the cost of activating white's queen. That's what these gambits are all about. It's not about checkmating right away, it's about getting rapid development. In the game, Larry Evans chose not to capture on c4, which is very, very understandable. No need to draw the white queen into the game, and instead, perhaps worried about the move knight d5 or even knight b5, the move c6 comes. A very sensible move, just to control some squares. Now we finally see the other knight get developed with tempo on this queen, and the queen comes all the way back to e7, and now we see d4. And what has Bobby Fischer gotten in exchange for this pawn on f4? Well, he's got this nice central pawn duo that everybody tries to aim for. Both of the knights are developed to the most natural squares. This bishop is threatening to come out to f4, and this bishop, for the moment, is well placed on c4, or after bishop takes c4, as played in the game. Now the queen will be well placed on c4. There's this principle about not developing the queen out too early, but that principle has sort of a very important caveat, right? If you develop your queen too early, it tends to be bad, but why is that? It's because the queen is going to get pushed around by the minor pieces. So in this case, it's very, very unclear how the minor pieces are actually going to attack the white queen. And so because of that, black has no way to exploit the queen being out early, and that just makes it a very, very active piece for white. Now, so far, black has been playing very, very greedy. Black has tried to keep everything, tried to keep the pawn on f4, tried to keep the center, tried not to give up a pawn with d5 either. And with that in mind, what do you think the natural follow-up is for black here? What should black play? I turn the question to you, chat room. How can black play in this particular position? In particular, the question is really about this f4 pawn. And so yeah, the chat is saying knight f6, get the pieces out, and there are really two competing ideas here. Number one, you can play something like knight f6, something like knight d7, something like knight a6, some developing move to try to get the pieces out, or you can play the move g5 and try to keep your pawn. Or you can play the move g5. And in this particular case, playing knight f6 I think would be a pretty big mistake for black. Objectively, probably it's not the worst move of all time, but thus far, black has been making these tiny little concessions in order to try to keep the material, right? We saw the queen come out to h4 and then lose a tempo after knight f3. We've seen the pawn go from d7 to d6, allowing white this extra central space, not kind of combating that earlier on. And we've seen black trade off this bishop and activating the white queen. So now it's sort of, at a point where black needs to make his play a little bit more consistent than knight f6, right? You can't make all these concessions and then say, okay, fine, now you can have my pawn back. Notably, by the way, if you were thinking you're getting this guy, the tactics just don't quite work out in your favor here. I think maybe they do? I didn't look too deeply at this, but I'm assuming this move is good enough. And there's just no way to defend this knight. If you go f6, or f5 rather, I can still take it. So moves like knight f6, they are not going to be what black should be doing here. Black needs to play consistently. If you made all these concessions to try to keep your pawn, then now's not the time to give up. You should try to keep the pawn. So Larry Evans does play the move g5, which I think is the most thematic choice. Now, the question for Bobby Fischer is, what do you do? You've gotten your great central pawn duo, you've gotten your knights out to the most natural squares, you've got a pretty active queen as well, but there are still some problems, right? This bishop, for one, is a bit of a problem. This king is also a bit of a problem because it's interfering with the rook's access to the center of the board, right? It's keeping this rook on h1 locked out of the game. And this is where the impressive stuff kind of starts happening. So chat, how would you continue with white here? Because I think this is one of the trickiest parts of playing an opening like the King's Gambit. When your opponent really does come after you and says, I'm going to keep this pawn, you gave me a free pawn, I'm going to keep it, and then I shall have more pawns than you. It can be a little bit difficult to actually prove that this central pawn advantage, this development advantage, is worth a pawn. You have to do something with it, or else black will slowly but surely catch back up with moves like bishop g7, knight a6, knight f6. Black is going to be catching up if you're not doing something active. So what do you do? What can be done here? Okay, there's some ideas in the chat. A lot of the players are looking at this g5 f4 construction here and realizing that this move h4 could be quite tempting. But h4, while it is a tempting move, it is going to have to be a move you're very, very cautious about. So something nobody in the chat room is mentioning is the idea that was played in the game. So chat room, while your ideas of h4 are very often good in openings like the King's Gambit, here Bobby wants to make use of all of these pieces, right? This knight and this queen in particular are not really ready to help out on the king's side. So moves like h4, just from a principled level, might not be the right idea here. For example, h4, g4. If you try to go to some square, like g5, your knight is actually going to get trapped on this square, and that will just be a full piece for black. So you would have to, in fact, come back to a square like knight e1 or knight g1, and you're still not quite picking up this pawn, right? Black is able to sort of defend this against anything you might try. So h4, not a bad move by any stretch, but perhaps g4, and black is still in control here. So what does Bobby do? Well, he counters an attack on the flank with an attack in the center, right? White's big advantage in the King's Gambit is not that he's always going to be regaining the pawn on f4. The advantage is you have drawn black's pawn away from the center, increasing your central presence, and that is what Bobby tries to make use of here. And so the best moves, in my opinion, are either e5, which was played in the game, or the move d5, something to make use of this central pawn majority. And so Bobby goes e5 in this case. Now, of course, with the black pieces here, priority number one tends to be keeping things a bit closed. When you are playing, the role of the green meister and you want to keep all the material, oftentimes you are lagging in development, as black is here. And when you lag in development, you must keep the center closed, right? If you're up in development, you want to open the center. Down in development, you want to close the center down. So here, Larry, of course, does not play d takes c, when perhaps now the time is right for the move h4, when g4 could be met by knight takes e5, but instead plays the natural move d5. You want to keep things closed in the center. And Bobby makes a pretty interesting decision here. Believe it or not, this is actually a pretty difficult choice for the queen. You can either come back to the center with a move like queen d3 or queen e2, or you can go with the interesting queen b3. And what's the idea of queen b3? Well, you're just sort of inhibiting black's development a little bit further because knight d7 would always be met by queen takes b7. In the game, Bobby played a little bit more consistently with his plan of the central control and goes queen d3. I think queen b3 was a fine move as well. Black now goes knight a6, still trying to get developed and trying to highlight that d3 might not be the safest square for the queen. And now, what does Bobby do? Well, he's pushed in the center, gotten this nice little central pawn wedge with some extra space, inhibiting Black's pieces a little bit, especially this bishop and this knight in particular. And now, once again, the question becomes, how can he play for an advantage in this position? So, chat, your idea of h4. I'm just going to give you a hint here. h4 is, in fact, a good idea for the position. But the question is, how do you make it work? How do you prepare this move? Because you don't really want to play h4 and only be sort of attacking the structure with half your pieces. So how do you actually make this work? That is the question. Jeff says we all said e5. I disagree, Jeff. I was reading. I didn't see it. Ah, okay. They did eventually come up with e5. I must rescind my comment about the chat room getting the question wrong. So yeah, it's a question of reorganizing White's pieces. So right now, it looks as though opening things up on the queen side of the board is going to be rather difficult for White, right? Maybe you go something like knight e2 and play for c4, but it feels a little bit artificial. This knight is sort of blocked from influencing the queen side for the moment by White's own pawns. However, the king side is the direction where White's pawns kind of point for the moment. White has this extra pawn on e5 to grant him more space on this side of the board, and so Bobby is looking to play on the king side. And again, the key break is going to be h4, like the chat room was mentioning a little bit earlier. Now, how do you prepare it? Well, you simply take the pieces that are on the queen side and you bring them to the king side. So Bobby starts with the move knight e2, pressuring f4, also allowing Bobby to sort of defend his center with a move like c3. Black did continue with knight b4. We saw queen d1, keeping an eye on the c2 pawn, and also, as I said, keeping an eye on the king side of the board as well. Black felt it was time to castle queenside, and then Bobby starts with a natural c3, driving the knight back to a6, and now is the time. Bobby has all of his pieces now pointing at the king side, at least all the pieces that he can use to point at the king side. The rooks are a bit harder to activate, and he decides the moment is right for the move h4. Notably, I think this is where Larry Evans started to lose the thread of the position a little bit. He went for this weird sort of knight a6, knight b4 tempo idea, gaining time on the queen, but while Larry was busy moving the knight around and castling queenside, Bobby had very much organized his entire army towards the king side. And I don't think White is really any worse in this position. Before this position, maybe White was doing a little bit worse with Black having this extra pawn, but now Bobby's pieces make sense and Black's pieces just don't. G4 is sort of the only real idea here. You can go f6, but this is just giving the pawn back after takes, takes, and takes. And as we know, Black's play thus far has been to be as greedy as possible and hang on to this pawn for dear life. So, rather than f6, g4 is still really the main idea. And now, rather than come back to e1 or g1, with this extra knight around to help attack f4, help guard some squares, Bobby felt h2 was the correct square for the knight, going after the g4 pawn as well. Now, with the g4 pawn hanging, it's actually a very, very difficult position for Black to get a hold of. So what's going on here? g4 is hanging, f4 is hanging, but it turns out there's one more pawn hanging in the position, and that is the h4 pawn. So this is the time in the game when there's no principles, there's no shortcuts. This is where chess becomes a game for dirty calculators. And the specifics in this case, I think, are going to work out pretty well for Bobby in most cases. Larry, I think, found a good move here, which was h5. And while this does give back the f4 pawn, it does cement this pawn on g4. And by doing that, you lock this knight out of the game for the moment. And it's going to take Bobby a few moves in order to reorganize his pieces again. So knight takes f4, played in the game. And now Larry has a decision. Do you take on h4, or do you not take on h4? And chat room, I'm going to leave it to you. I'll give you a little bit of a hint here. Don't waste too much time sort of looking for knockout punches after queen h4 with some knight discovery, because, and the ghost is closing the door to the studio. That really scared me, but that's okay. Don't look for too many knockout punches after queen takes h4. I don't think they really exist. So it's more of a positional question. Is it good for black to capture this pawn on h4 or not? Does it help? Joe says, be greedy. Skull says, we don't care about material. We want to attack the king. Okay. I don't know what Skull is suggesting, though. It's fine to want to attack the king, but do you want to attack the king by taking the pawn or attack the king some other way? So yeah, Larry in this case is making the mistake that a lot of people in the chat room are making. Not everybody, but a lot of people. And that is, so far, black has played like the greediest person alive and has just captured the pawn, tried to maintain the pawn, tried to get everything available to him and keep everything available to him. And so staying consistent with that, Larry does capture this pawn on h4. But it turns out that this move does give white the advantage. Why does this move give white the advantage? Well, it's not any knockout punch. It's not some crazy e6 idea, some knight takes g4 idea. These ideas simply just aren't working, right? The rook on h1 is hanging for the moment. e6 doesn't really do enough. Like if you go e6, you can just take. If you take me back, I have queen f6 check. Things like this, right? So there's no knockout punch for white. But what there is now an h-file, right? If we go back to this position, this piece is out of the game, this piece is out of the game, and after knight takes f4, it's true that these two pieces are starting to play again, but even the queen is sort of stuck looking at this pawn on the g4 square. And so with black's sort of hold on the position a little bit, that's why black is doing okay here, because these four pieces in particular are sort of being very much contained by black's structure. Now, by playing queen takes h4, you very much open up this rook, and we'll see with Bobby's next move, you're going to be activating this knight as well, and then eventually this queen as well. All of the white pieces sort of spring to life after queen takes h4. What would have been a better move? Well, I think it turns out white actually does have a threat. For example, if you just play some move like this, I think knight takes h5 can be played because of queen takes g4 with check. So some simple move like queen d7, sort of stepping out of the checking idea on g4. And I think black is doing okay here. What do the next moves look like? Well, if you try something like king g1 to get this piece in the game. Now there are sort of some crazy ideas here, but simple development I think is going to be okay for black here. For example, knight f1, knight f5, and black is still playing for this containment idea, just keeping the white pieces at bay. And I don't think black is going to be better, but I also don't think black is going to be worse here, right? These pieces are still just a little bit too awkward for white to ever really have a serious advantage. So what happens instead? Well, Larry gets greedy, takes a pawn on h4. And now chat, white to move, and, oh, sorry. My fault for using a touchpad there. How dare I touch a touchpad on a laptop? White to move and get a very serious advantage. It may have been spoiled by that quick little scroll, but you'll have to be pretty fast with your eyes to catch that one, I think. White to move and secure an advantage. So yeah, it's the simple move here. I mentioned it in another line that we just looked at, but the trick for white is just getting these pieces active. It's all about the activity in these crazy openings, and the best way to get these pieces active is the slightly strange-looking king g1. You just vacate the f1 square for the knight, you defend the rook, unpinning the knight as well. Now knight takes g4 is an actual threat, for example. and here, white is going to be much better. Black finally decided to develop the kingside and goes knight h6, and this move is to play against the idea of knight takes g4, when now there's no pin on the h-file to exploit. But instead, Bobby just goes knight f1 and regains this pawn on h5. And so, what do we have? Well, we have a trade of the h4 pawn for the h5 pawn. And at first glance, you might say, well, white's king is on g1, black's king is on the queen side. Why not open the h-file? But in this case, you have to look at the specifics. Chess is a game of specifics, and here, the specifics favor white, right? With the h-pawns on the board, these two pieces were awful. This queen was also not great. With the h-pawns off the board, the rook is active, this knight is going to come into play, this queen is very active, and white is sort of just crushing now. Black tries the move rook g8 here, which is sort of just desperately trying to hang on to the g4 pawn. Now, white develops out this other knight once again. We see rook g6 by black, and notably, these two pieces just aren't playing in the game. And here, the knockout punches start to come. White brings this knight back to f4, this rook comes up to g5, and more simple development by Bobby Fischer. And black has sort of just been developed to death, right? White just spent all of his time activating his pieces, and black is now crumbling. Knight c7 comes on the board, finally rerouting this knight, but queen d2 is piling on the pressure on this diagonal. The rook comes back to g8, this rook going for quite the dance here. Knight f to e2 is Bobby Fischer's choice. Sorry, not knight g2, but knight f to e2. And the pressure has now finally broken through on this knight, which is actually trapped. And so Bobby wins this piece on h6, and sort of out of nowhere, just wins the entire game. The game did continue for a few moments. f6 was played, ef, queen f, bishop takes h6, and black goes bishop d6 with a little bit of activity, but now all of Bobby's pieces are in the game, and Bobby has more pieces. So queen e6, bishop back to f4, d e8, rook h6, takes, queen e7, and very, very shortly, this game was resigned by Larry Evans, just down a full piece with no compensation. So this, I think, is the best example of Bobby Fischer playing with more activity, right? This is the game that Bobby proved he was the person who could improve his pieces the best, right? He played against the Greedmeister Larry Evans and came out on top. Larry tried to hold on to everything, take everything, control everything, but you just can't always play like that. You have to make some concessions in chess. There's a very famous quote that says, chess is a game of give and take, and that's very much true. To get something, you have to give something. And in this case, Larry tried to get all of the material gains, but he gave Bobby Fischer a bit too much activity, and that activity came to bite Larry Evans. All right, any questions on this game before I move on to a little bit of a shorter one? All right, let us continue then. Up next, while the first game may look pretty brilliant, there were a lot of games that could potentially be deserving of a brilliancy prize. Most people cite this next game when they talk about Bobby Fischer playing brilliant chess in this championship. Of course, they cite a lot of games, but this is the game that sort of stands out. And it's a game against Robert Byrne. Not the only Byrne in the championship this year. There was also a Donald Byrne, which did confuse me a little bit, to be honest. I'm not the greatest chess historian. I was like, wait, Bobby played Byrne twice. But no, they were different people. But okay, let's just jump into it here. We'll see what Robert Byrne played against Robert James Fischer. We had d4, knight f6, c4, g6 by Bobby, g3, c6, bishop g2, and d5. cd5, cd5, knight c3, and bishop g7. So what do we have in this position? Well, we have Bobby going for this fianchetto setup, and then we have a very interesting structure in the center. The c-pawns have been traded off, leaving only these d-pawns sitting on d4 and d5. And what is the character of this structure? Well, normally it's a pretty boring one. You get this structure from openings like the Exchange Slav, but there is a very interesting thing going on here, which is that both sides have committed to fianchettoing their bishops. What does this mean? Well, in this setup, usually the pawn on d4 and the pawn on d5, they're both pretty solid, right? Both sides may potentially play moves like e3 and e6, and with that, both of these bishops are really going to be stunted on their fianchettoed squares. These tend to just be bad pieces in this structure from my experience. So keep an eye out during this game for potential ideas for Bobby to activate this bishop on g7 and for Byrne to try and activate the bishop on g2. It's going to be interesting to see their different approach to this problem. In the game, white does just start with the move e3, very directly defending the d4 pawn and saying, I'm going to lock your bishop out of the game. Now, Bobby took a little bit of a different approach, did not respond with the move e6, but just castled the king. We see knight g to e2 by white, and perhaps now white is trying to activate this bishop using the pieces, hinting that this knight might come out to f4, and white is going to try to pile up on this d5 pawn. Meanwhile, black plays knight c6. We see castles by castles by white, and now the problem of the bishops is solved by both players. There's not too much of a future, to be honest, on this diagonal for the bishop. Keep in mind that the sometimes common idea of trying to trade off the light-squared bishops on h3 just doesn't make sense here, right? And this is something that I've seen actually in a lot of like amateur games, even slightly higher level games as well. In positions like this, it makes no sense to trade off these light-squared bishops. This is a bad piece. This is not a good piece. Just because it's fianchettoed doesn't mean it's a good piece. It's a bad piece staring at a d5 pawn. And so, why should black try, so hard to get rid of it? And the answer is you just shouldn't. You just shouldn't. In this case, Bobby Fischer manages to find a more useful square for this bishop, making it potentially even more useful than the bishop on g2. How does he do that? Well, he goes b6. White responds in kind with b3, but now Bobby brings the bishop out to a6, and it's very clear which bishop, is doing more work here. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if white would, very much later in the game, try to trade off this bishop on f1. White responds in kind, though, and goes bishop a3. And now it's a question of how do you actually make any tangible progress in this position? And it's a question I'm going to ask the chat room once again. So you've developed all the minor pieces. We now have this one open C file. How do you actually improve your pieces in this game? So don't just give me a move here. Give me a plan to improve the pieces. And yeah, Pippenchuk has something along the right idea. Everybody wanted to play rook e8 to unpin the e-pawn, but the idea in this case for Bobby is not necessarily to just go e6, going for the same sort of conservative stunting of the bishop for white, but Bobby is interested in activating his own bishop on g7. So the idea here is rook e8. White responded with queen d2. And now Bobby makes the very committal decision to push this pawn not to e6, but all the way to e5. And what we're going to see is that this is sort of a game of give and take once again for Bobby Fischer. In this case, Bobby is giving white the better structure. Of course, after d takes e5, this pawn is going to be a bit weak. What is Bobby getting in exchange for it? Well, an active piece on g7 and an active square for this knight on e5. So once again, Bobby turns out to be playing this sort of game of give and take at just a higher level than his opponents. Because I do think this was just a good position now for black, right? Rook e8, and all of the black's pieces are springing to life. We do see knight takes e5 by black, And it's a bit too early to go capturing this pawn because this white queen is just a little bit overworked. For example, takes, and sorry, there's even knight f3 check here as well. But this is the tactic that I saw when, of course, black would be winning. So a bit too early to be capturing on d5, so tactically this is working out. And then Robert Byrne makes a mistake, believe it or not. Makes a mistake. So the most natural move in the position, in my opinion, is to bring a rook to the d1 square. You can go rook a d1, or you can go rook f d1. And it's very, very important which rook goes to d1. So, chat room, which rook goes to the d1 square? So, yeah, Great Wolf has an interesting question that we'll come back to, but then remind me if I forget, but I will come back to that. But let's focus on this one for now. And as always, the mysterious rook moves are somewhat splitting the chat, although it does appear that rook a d1 is slightly in the lead for the moment amongst the chat. Rook f d1 making a comeback, though, seeing a lot of Fs in the chats. And it turns out the a rook is the correct rook to bring to d1. But the reason as to why is so deep and so subtle that you can't blame Byrne for moving the f rook. In my opinion, the most natural move is actually the move rook f to d1. Why is that the most natural? Well, this really great bishop on a6 is sort of just bearing down on this rook. It's pinning this knight. It's a bit uncomfortable, right? So white would love to be able to play rook f to d1, as he did in the game. However, it turns out rook a to d1 is better. Why is that? Well, after rook f to d1, black sort of unleashes just a very wild series of moves here. Bobby Fischer starts with knight d3, and seemingly this is just a bad move, right? Seemingly, this move is just pretty bad. Why is this move pretty bad? Well, you put the knight on d3, it looks great there, but after queen c2, this knight is attacked twice, and how do you actually escape? So chat, what was Bobby's idea? Your knight is attacked twice. If you think you're just going to move back here, you're going to find your d-pawn is hanging. What to do with black? Seemingly a bad move. And yeah, of course, you know, once you see this position and you see that there's actually no other options, you sort of run into knight takes f2 by force. And this was Bobby Fischer's idea from afar here, which is pretty incredible to see. All right, coming up with knight d3, knight takes f2 is definitely not easy. So, you know, white needs to take this knight, and he does. What's the follow-up? Well, of course, it's knight g4 check. The king comes back to g1, and knight takes e3, attacking queen, rook, and bishop. The queen moves out of the way, and here I did see some notes on the game, but apparently Byrne at this moment was pondering why Bobby Fischer chose this line, because it seems as though, you know, it might just be good for white, right? Like you take this rook on d1, you get rook takes d1, and for the moment, white is holding everything together. White has two pieces for the rook and two pawns, but this d-pawn is going to be very weak, right? And, you know, not that black is losing here, but why would Bobby Fischer choose this line? And, okay, the chat's a bit ahead of me on this one. The idea is not knight takes d1. The idea, of course, is knight takes g2. And this, apparently, is the point of Bobby Fischer's play thus far. This move, knight takes g2. You know, for all my words about this bishop on g2 being a very bad piece, it did serve one very useful purpose, and that purpose was defending the king. Now, that purpose is not so easy to fill with the bishop off the board. King takes g2 played, and then the nice follow-up here for Bobby Fischer is just a simple removal of the defender of this knight on e2. Right? We would love to play rook takes e2 and win the game, but this knight is in the way, and so Bobby plays d4. Seemingly, though, still under control for white. I don't have to move this knight, and Byrne plays knight takes d4 instead, and Bobby just gives a little check. I'll give you this move. And then who can guess the final move of the game here? The final move of the game. I suspect Pippinchuck has seen the game before in the chat. Queen f6 and rook a to d8 has been suggested by Great Wolf. Oh, and I'm messing things up. Okay. Of course, it is a very famous game. Yeah, Queen f6 is okay. Queen f4 would likely be the answer, and I'm gonna, sort of break the fourth wall here a little bit. There's a lot of history around the game where everybody is writing about these two, commentators over the game, two unnamed grandmasters, sort of leaning back, explaining to the crowd. Yet now Byrne is simply up a piece, and he will go on to win the game. And after Fischer's next move, queen d7, Byrne actually resigns. And supposedly, the commentators were telling, their spectators that yes, okay, queen d7 and Bobby has resigned. Byrne has won the game. Of course, after queen d7, it was Byrne who resigned and Fischer who won. And while this is a great story, I actually find myself to be a little bit skeptical of it. Why is that? Well, black is winning with many, many moves here. Rook c8 is just a very, very simple move, but it's a move that highlights the fact that white really can't move his pieces, right? You can't even move this knight because of queen f6 check, and it's just domination at this point. Like Bobby Fischer is just crushing here. Queen c8 wins the game, queen d7 wins the game, queen c7 wins the game, bishop a6 is fine for black, even doing nothing. Playing the move h5 in this position is good for black. So I'm a little bit skeptical about this story where two unnamed grandmasters are evaluating this position as winning for Byrne and Bobby Fischer resigns. But it is, a nice story, regardless of how true it is. In the game, Bobby Fischer did not play queen f6, but the very, very accurate queen to d7. Now, what is the point? Well, the point is we are coming after the king with queen h3 check. What is the point of that? Well, let's say white plays a very good defensive move like queen f2. Then queen h3 check would still come, king g1. And who sees the knockout blow here? Black to move and win the game. Black to move and win the game. And yes, it is, in fact, not bishop d4 first. Bishop d4 first would be a big mistake. If you go bishop d4, rook takes d4, and white is defending and winning. But you first go rook e1 check, and this is the nice distraction sacrifice. If queen takes rook, then queen g2 is mate, and if rook takes rook, then bishop takes d4. And again, the queen is being distracted from her very important role of guarding against checkmate on g2. If you take this, this is mate. If you go rook e3, doesn't help. I just take that anyways. And so white here would be dead in the water. Simply nothing to be done here for Byrne, which is why he resigned after queen d7. Instead of playing queen f2. Would have been nice to see it appear on the board, but Byrne had seen enough. He was like, get me out of this game. Get me out of this game. And yeah, as Ignacio is saying in the chat, the most impressive fact is that this attack seemingly came out of nowhere. But really, did it come out of nowhere? I think, while of course, it's easy to say the move of the game is knight d3, knight takes f2, I think this game was positionally winning by Fischer with this move e5. Now, was white winning? Was black winning on the board after e5? I don't think so. But e5 showed that Bobby had a deeper understanding of this give and take in chess with the move e5. He understood that the activity he was getting was better than the structural weakness that he was giving. And that is really where the the top of the top separate themselves from their competition. It's moves like e5 that do it, right? Any old 2750 can calculate knight d3, knight takes f2. Okay, maybe they can't, but even if they could, I don't think many 2750s have this deep understanding about playing for e5 in positions like this. Even if they do today, back then, I think this sort of just native intuition for when you can make these positional sacrifices for activity gains is very, very strange. Great Wolf did have a question earlier, though, about specifically, I think, this move b6. So this bishop, of course, has this open diagonal here that it can develop out to. And so he was asking, well, so why would you play b6 here? Why open a second diagonal for the bishop when the bishop already has one diagonal available? And that comes down to a few different things. First and foremost, the most important thing to keep in mind is the squares that you're weakening, and secondly, if you can afford to spend the time to do it. If this was some wild and crazy opening where every tempo mattered, then a move like b6 would likely be very bad. In this case, it's not. It's just total symmetry, and white is not exactly making too many immediate threats, so the move b6 is fine by the time spent. And it's not like, you know, the moves you see by white, g3 and e3, which are actually weakening the light squares here. So that is why black can play like this. Now, why does black play like this? Well, the advantage is this diagonal is simply much more important than any diagonal over here on the king side of the board, right? It's so much more valuable to be putting this pressure on this knight and this rook and controlling as well this d3 square, as we saw in the game. So any other questions on this game? If Carlsen was white after the move e5 by black, could he defend? I don't know. Maybe, probably. But Magnus Carlsen was not white in the game. Where did white go wrong? Well, for one, this was a pretty timid opening. As far as openings go, this is about as timid as they come by white. And then beyond that, I think all of these moves were honestly fine by white. I think if white goes rook a d1 here, white is probably still doing okay. Right, black does have a little bit of this extra activity, but white does have this nice structural advantage. And given a few more moves, if white gets something like knight f4, challenging this pawn, or even knight d4, just blockading and holding the position, then I think white is going to be doing okay. So rook fd1, then after knight d3, it's still not too late to not lose the game. White could have played something like knight to f4, and this definitely keeps the game going, although black is probably going to be much better, right? Just defending f2 is the important thing to spot here. Okay. If Byrne had played the a rook to d1, he wouldn't have fallen to such disaster. Well, you know, it's always a game of what if. If white played rook a to d1, maybe he would have made a mistake later in the game. But objectively, white is not really doing that badly after rook a to d1, although black is by no means worse, thanks to this activity of his pieces. But okay, let us move along. Let's check out now a little bit of a different game by Bobby Fischer. His opponent in this game is William Addison, which, as I've said before, I'm not the greatest chess historian in the world, but I think Addison is one of those names that might have shown up in a few U.S. championships, but he wasn't exactly winning too many of them. So Addison may be a little bit of a bigger underdog than everyone else when playing Bobby Fischer, but we'll see here that he did manage to put up a very nice fight. And so I wanted to analyze this game because, you know, in the first game, we saw Bobby Fischer defending well and playing for activity. In the second game, we saw Bobby Fischer sort of making something out of nothing. He took a symmetrical position and still managed to activate his pieces. And now I want to look at slightly more of a positional grind, right? As I've said, in order to go 11-0, you sort of have to be, you know, better than your opponents in every aspect of chess. And this, I think, is an aspect that we hadn't yet seen by Bobby so far in the event. So let's take a look at it. Addison starts with the move e4. We get e5, knight f3, knight c6. And it's a Ruy Lopez. We get a6, bishop a4. And Bobby goes for this line with the immediate b5. And this is sort of an early concession almost by black. The idea of the Ruy is sort of to draw these black pawns forward so that a little bit later on they can sort of be exploited for their weaknesses. But it's a very common opening variation still. So bishop b3, and the point of black's play with drawing these pawns so far out is to immediately go after this bishop. So we get knight a5, and then white didn't play the main move here. These days, I think castles is the most common, but white immediately broke in the center with the move of d4. Bobby now has to sort of deal with this threat to the e5 pawn, and so we see e takes d4 in the game. Queen takes d4 now, play it as well. And Bobby develops out with knight e7, which is sort of not the move that would come to mind for many people right off the bat, but it's a perfectly sensible move. Bobby likely didn't want to come out to f6 for fear of this e-pawn stepping out to e5 when this knight is just a little bit stuck. So knight e7 instead. Bobby is just finding another way to get developed. White played the move c3, which is making a threat. That threat is to save this bishop, and so now Bobby does go ahead and capture on b3. We get a takes b3, bishop b7, Bobby still just continuing to develop the pieces, bishop f4, and now black is ready to sort of take over the game. I think maybe bishop f4 was a bit on the lax side by William Addison here. So black to move and start playing for the advantage already. And yes, the chess historians are thankfully in the chat, even if they're not on the stream. And I'm being told Addison played in 5 U.S. championships, did fairly well, and was a respected American master. And that was sort of the feeling I got. I think he was, definitely on the scene at the top of the country, but, sort of born in a time where there were some very, very good chess players in the United States. Perhaps got a little bit overshadowed. So yeah, the thing to do here with black is a little bit actually counterintuitive. I think sort of the safe way to play is to go something like knight g6. Perhaps this is one reason why putting the bishop on f4 was a little bit lax. It allows black to sort of gain this tempo. Something like bishop g3, perhaps. And then you can even just play something like bishop e7 and develop your pieces and be living life. Although I might be hanging a pawn, right? But if something like bishop g5, for example, then I think you can go something like bishop e7 with the point that after this stuff, the e-pawn would be hanging. So bishop g3 or something, and then black should still try to get developed, and you can do so with something like c5, and again, playing bishop e7 in the near future. I think that would have been fine for black, but what Bobby does is, immediately strikes back in the center with the move d5. And as far as a principled explanation as to why this is sort of working out for Bobby, it's not immediately apparent, right? Bobby is further away from getting castled than white is, so why is he justified in actually opening up the center here? Well, I think it's because of this move, bishop f4 once again. Bishop f4, while it looks like a very active square for the bishop, is actually creating, of course, a loose piece, and we all know that loose pieces start to lead to tactics for the opponent. And in this case now, if e takes d5, we probably would have seen knight takes d5, and white is just feeling a little bit uncomfortable about having this bishop here on the f4 square. If you castle, this will definitely be captured by black. If you check knight e6, so you have to take. Now bishop e7, and castles, and Bobby is doing pretty well here. Why is he doing pretty well here? Well, you've got two bishops, a wide open center, and black should definitely have some advantage. So, it's because of this bishop on f4 that black is able to play d5. White is going to have to spend some time to deal with this threat to the bishop on f4, for example, something like bishop g3, and then it's actually going to be black who is exploiting the open e-file before white, with moves like queen e7 check, moves like c5, queen e7 as well. And that's why d5 is working for black. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is try not to make loose pieces, and when your opponent makes loose pieces, look to sort of exploit that any way you can. In this case, Knight g6, exploiting the loose piece, would gain time for black, and d5, opening up the center, is playable and good for black because this bishop on f4 is so loose. Now, if white had played a move like kingside castles, for example, then I think d5 is going to be a little bit harder to prove anything with for black. For example, if d5, ed5, now knight takes d5 simply isn't really playable because this file is just too wide open. So what is that? What is the point of all that? The point again is loose pieces are bad. Don't make them. Loose pieces are awful. So d5 by Bobby Fischer, and then Addison felt that the time was right to play e5, not willing to give this knight the d5 square and taking a bit more central space. Now Bobby finds the correct idea once again, which is still sort of exploiting this bishop on f4 with the move c5. Now if queen takes c5, guess what? There is a winning tactic here. So, chat room, black to move and win after queen takes c5. So knight g6 doesn't quite work actually. It's tempting to try to somehow combine this queen with the weakness of the bishop, but the queen can retreat to defend. And yeah, the chat room has got it now. Knight f5 is miraculously somehow trapping the queen in the center of the board. All of the squares are simply defended. And so yeah, that would be the game. That's that. So after c5, perhaps this is what Addison missed, by the way, because if black doesn't play c5 here, white is going to play the move b4 very, very, very quickly and sort of put a stop to any c5 ideas. But in the game, c5 was not missed. Fischer found it. We see the queen come back to d3, and now we do still see knight g6, and white continues to pay for putting this bishop on f4 with losing yet another tempo in the form of bishop g3. Black develops now with bishop e7. We have knight b to d2. And now we see a very interesting idea by Fischer. So, black to move in this case and come up with a plan. Black to move and come up with a plan. What do you think, chat? Because I'm not going to lie to you, this one I think is pretty incredible by Bobby Fischer. This one is pretty incredible. This one is pretty incredible, in my opinion. So, there are a lot of good ideas in the chat, and it does turn out this is one of those positions where it's difficult to decide where to play, right? You have all of this space already on the queen side of the board, and you want to maintain that. You don't want to push it too far, though, because white does have some weaknesses back here. But you sort of want to maintain this nice central space guarding all these squares. You'd like to somehow maybe blockade or attack this pawn. But beyond that, it's not super clear how to advance. Maybe this break of d4, as has been mentioned in the chat, is going to be a critical one to open up this bishop, open up the d file as well. And so d4 is definitely going to be on black's mind. But Bobby actually does something really, really interesting. I think a lot of players would castle here, and I don't think castles is a bad move at all. But Bobby manages to apply a little bit more pressure to Addison here by first going knight f8, allowing white to castle, and then knight e6. This is just a very natural rerouting of the knight. e6 blockades this pawn, prepares the break of d4, and then after rook a to d1, does something pretty incredible, right? Again, I would probably castle 9 times out of 10 here, but Bobby Fischer says, look, my king is safe right here. This pawn is not going anywhere. I have good control of the center. I am going to go g5 and take space on the king side as well. And a lot of times, you know, this comes with drawbacks, right? It weakens squares. It gives your opponent chances for counterplay. But taking space like this is a really effective way to put some pressure on the opponent, right? When you're facing down pawns on g5, and after h3, pawns on h5 as well. All of a sudden, you're still calculating ideas of g4, you're still calculating ideas of maybe a5, a4, some days even c4, b4, all of these breaks. And now you're also thinking about g4, right? And it's just not easy when your opponent is sort of coming after you on all sides of the board like this. That being said, it does make some weaknesses and does come with some risk. So, word of warning, if you want to use this in your own games, you're probably going to lose some games if you start doing h5, g5, but probably also going to win some games. Bobby followed this up with queen b6, which is just an improving move for the queen, getting the queen off of the same file as this rook, perhaps preparing a move like rook d8 if necessary. And then after knight f1, a natural improving move for white, Bobby decided it was go time. He has the pieces where he wants them, and he doesn't really want to see this knight landing on the f5 square, so he does break through now with the move of d4. Of course, after cd4, this pawn is not really hanging thanks to the idea of rook d8. So d4 played in the game, and then we actually see Addison start to crumble a little bit. Addison plays the move knight 3 to d2, and this one is a little bit beyond me, to be honest. I'm not entirely sure what the idea was here. You get the feeling that he wanted to do something like knight e4 and putting a knight on f6 or d6, but why not use this knight? Why did this knight go to f1 if you're putting this knight on d2? It just didn't make a lot of sense to me, and this move does turn out to be a bit of a mistake. Bobby now continues playing all sides of the board with the move g4, white goes h4, and now queen c6, and it's pretty clear what's going on here. And actually, yeah, I'm sorry, I should mention, knight d2 does have the benefit of stepping out of the way of this idea of g4, but again, I just don't think it was very good, because a lot of times after something like g4, like let's say this knight came to d2, you want to actually put this knight on h4 instead, and again, head into the f5 square. So, queen c6, and white tries to go queen e4 to trade off the queens. And now Bobby actually doesn't shy away from this, just castles queenside, takes, and we have a queenless position now. Why is Bobby so fine with entering this queenless position? Well, it's something called the principle of two weaknesses. White has sort of a general weakness on the queen side. These b pawns are often going to be weak, and thanks to this expansion on the king side, Bobby is understanding that he's making more weaknesses over here, and these are just too many weaknesses for white to really keep together. In the game, c4 was played, king d7, simply improving the king a little bit and allowing the rooks access to the queen side of the board. Rook a1, rook a8 to defend, knight e4, takes, now knight g7, and it's clear that white is not going to be able to keep these pawns together and this pawn together all at the same time. Knight d2 was played, now knight f5, and things start to drop. Rook f4, king e6, just keeping everything solid. Knight e4, takes on c4, rook b8, and now once again, weakness on the queen side, weakness on the king side, and even a weakness in the center for white, and this is just simply way too much for white to hold together. Rook a2, rook b4 was played, going after the c pawn as well. Knight d2, just defending, but Bobby does now collect this pawn on h4, and the game ends very shortly. Rook e4, bishop g5, going after the knight, f4, takes, check, and another pawn for black, and Addison decided to throw in the towel here. So, what does this game show? Well, it showed that Bobby Fischer was playing very excellent positional chess as well. This is a classic example of black sort of making a weakness early on the queen side, but then, rather than playing simple moves like kingside castles that I think many players would play, Bobby went for more and managed to create a second weakness on the king side for white to deal with, and thanks to that, he was able to convert this game very cleanly and pretty easily as well. Well, I guess Bobby always makes it look easy. Obviously, it wasn't that easy, but you know, he was able to do it. That is going to do it for this lecture here on the road to 2000. Up next, I am actually going to look at a few really key end games from this same tournament that Bobby went 11-0 at. And that's going to be coming up in the end game class that I think Ben has linked in the chat already. So please do join me there. But for the Road to 2000, that is all for tonight. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.